Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crucial Conversations podcast. My goal on this platform is to empower others towards self-fulfillment. These are the conversations that you need to have to unlock your maximum potential. Whether you are feeling confused about your path in life, falling in love, starting a business, healing your inner child, moving to a foreign country, embarking on your spiritual journey, or building generational wealth, let's talk. The range of emotions and experiences that allow us to fully live our lives on Earth are beautiful and yet can be difficult to navigate. My goal is to create a safe space to talk about life, the good and the bad, in an effort to share wisdom, advice, and insight. I want to connect with you. I want to encourage you and empower you to live the life of your dreams, while reminding you that that does not always mean that you need to change your circumstances. Together, we will help each other level up and have the crucial conversations necessary to do so. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Crucial Conversations podcast. I am ecstatic for today's episode because I have Sara Nasser, who is going to be touching on some amazing topics today and opening up some intriguing conversation that I am very, very excited to share with all of you guys. Sara is a Middle Eastern clinical mental health counselor and art therapist with experience dealing with anxiety, generational trauma, stress, anger, and depression. In her feature on Psychology Today's website, she details her clinical methodologies and their roots in cognitive behavioral, person-centered, acceptance and commitment therapy, and existential approaches, which Sara blends to create a customized therapeutic experience for each client. As an art therapist, she utilizes creative expression as a valuable tool for self-discovery and growth. Today, we're going to be talking about the stigma surrounding mental health and illness, bridging the gap between religion and mental health, art therapy, imposter syndrome, and a couple of more super exciting topics. So, Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So I am really, really excited to start this conversation. I want to get right into it. When I was reviewing Sara's page, I was reading through her biography and some of the practices that she will implement in her, work with her clients and the approaches that she takes. And the first thing that I want to kind of talk about is the difference between Western and Eastern culture and the acceptance of mental health and what the stigmas associated with each culture might look like for someone who is dealing with mental health. I want to kind of allow you to share a little bit of your story and then kind of bridge that into what you feel the stigma is about mental health in Western culture versus Eastern culture.
Sure. So for myself personally, I started dealing with anxiety towards the end of my senior year in high school. And at that point, I really didn't know what anxiety was, let alone mental health as a whole. So it was an incredibly confusing time for me. It was a very isolating time because mental health just wasn't talked about. The only thing we really knew about mental health was like mental illnesses and kind of having that label on you as a crazy person. So it wasn't something that anybody was really going to be open talking about. But it just got to the point for myself where I feel like I needed to figure this out because this was just not working for me. It was really debilitating. It was really paralyzing. So I needed some help. But every time I reached out to people within the community, they just looked at it through a religious lens. So they wanted me to pray more, or they were telling me I wasn't praying enough, or I wasn't a good enough Muslim. And if I just believed in God a little bit more, then I wouldn't be experiencing anxiety, because a true believer leaves everything in God's hands and they wouldn't be experiencing any anxiety. And obviously, that was something that didn't work for me. It was something that was really discouraging, to feel as though you are currently struggling with something and it's all your fault and you're doing something wrong, or you're not doing something well enough to get yourself better. But through educating myself and through trial and error, I was able to navigate through my anxiety in a healthy way, to gain a bunch of coping skills that really helped me to work through it once I started college as well. So by the time I did start college, I just kind of had this feeling that there was no way I went through all of this and experienced all of this without some sort of greater purpose. So I began to study therapy and psychology, and that was the route that I took because I felt as though if I am able to help just one person from my community feel less alone in their experience, then this was all worth it. Then all of that distress, all of that depression, all of that anxiety was worth it. So I just wanted to take back everything that I learned and pour it back into my community.
That's beautiful. Now, with your personal experience and really trying to look externally for help initially and being shot down with the fact that you weren't a strong enough believer in God, what do you think the gap between mental health and religion or spirituality looks like right now? And how do you think we can bridge the two together?
Sure. So I think people hold on to a belief that we must fully hand things over to God when it comes to many things, including our mental health, and to just kind of put it all into his hands. And to a certain degree, I definitely understand this because we need to have faith that we're going to be okay in the end, and it brings people a sense of comfort. But we can't just hand it over to God and then wait and do nothing on our end. And something that's written in the Quran, which is the holy book for Muslims, states, God does not change the condition of a people unless they change what is within themselves. So if we believe that God is the creator of all, he created psychology, he created theories, therapists, psychiatrists, medications. So who are we really to turn up our nose at God's creations and not utilize them? So I think you can definitely be a practicing Christian, a practicing Jew, a practicing Muslim with full faith in God, but still utilize tangible approaches to work on your mental health. And spirituality and faith can be an extremely beneficial tool when it comes to many mental health issues. But sometimes for people, that isn't always enough. And it's okay to say that. It doesn't make you any less of a believer or worshiper or follower of a faith. It simply means you're taking a step further and utilizing God's blessings or creations to further help yourself or your condition.
I love that. I think that that is really important because I know that it can be very difficult to battle with those kinds of responses when it then falls again on you and like you're alone in this and that you're not strong enough, but you're also not a strong enough believer, so you can't necessarily rely on God because you shouldn't be experiencing these things in their eyes if you were a strong enough believer. Now, with the difference between the Western and the Eastern acceptance of mental health, the individualistic versus collectivist scope, and what does that look like when you are approaching the practice with your clients that come from different cultural backgrounds?
Right. So, in general, I think I always try to view my clients from a multicultural lens to begin with. The majority of psychological theories were created by white men with the idea of treating white individuals in mind, so they don't really take into consideration the nuances and the complexities of other cultures and belief systems. So I incorporate these theories lightly. I will come across individuals who go to therapists to talk about family conflict, and the therapist will suggest at some point for the client to move out, to place strict boundaries, or to cut off their families. And this would leave these individuals feeling extremely misunderstood and frustrated. There can be serious consequences to leaving the familial home, especially before marriage, for many cultures. And growing up in a collectivist culture with an emphasis placed on family and the consideration of their thoughts, feelings, emotions, you can run the risk of seriously damaging these relationships, which may not be an immediate thought for a therapist who comes from an individualistic culture where the wants and needs of the individual far outweigh the group or community. So it's definitely important for a therapist to have knowledge on both of these cultures, to understand which culture their client is coming from, and to make sure they're not placing any of their own personal or conflicting beliefs onto the client. Just because this is something that might work for you or your culture doesn't mean it's going to work for your client. It can have serious detrimental outcomes if they do put it into practice.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of anxiety, I know, for myself and some of my loved ones come from that idea that you need to fit into a box, whether it's instilled by your family or your community or the society that you're living in. Some of those anxious feelings about trying to be someone that isn't necessarily sitting right with you is what creates some of that anxiety. And so I think what what I appreciate about your approach is that you create a space for individuals or even communities, if you work with multiple people at a time, to truly embody who they are and give them different lines of sight to be able to come to that understanding on their own. Because I feel like anxiety and this identity crisis, and I know we'll touch on imposter syndrome, really stems from trying to be something or someone that you're not, or trying to live up to expectations outside of your own. And I think that also comes back to the cultural influence and what that looks like to be an active member in a society. And so I appreciate you opening up that space. And I think that a lot of people aren't necessarily used to it, because in this lifetime, they have been living for someone else, or the way that someone else has intended for them to live for so long, that it's probably very new to some of your clients that you work with. So I think that that's very beautiful. Now, with your approach to some of your clients, you mentioned that you take an existential approach. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like in some of your practices.
Sure. So I definitely think an eclectic therapist, which means I combine a whole bunch of different approaches. And like I said earlier, I just approach these theories very lightly in my practice, just kind of taking into consideration the client themselves as an individual, and just knowing that one size does not fit all. But through an existential approach, what I really appreciate is just the focus more so on the emphasis of searching for meaning, which ties into many teachings of logotherapy, which I also appreciate. And logotherapy translates to healing through meaning. It's a Greek word, and it was founded by somebody named Viktor Frankl, who actually has a really interesting story. He was an Austrian psychiatrist, and he's also a survivor of the Holocaust. So during his times in the concentration camps, he came up with the basis of logotherapy, which is the theory that through a search for meaning in life, individuals could endure and overcome suffering. And it emphasizes that life can have a purpose even in the face of suffering, and that individuals can find meaning through their attitudes, choices, and actions. And so the primary goal of logotherapy is to help individuals discover and pursue their unique sense of meaning and purpose in life. And there are kind of three distinct ways where one can kind of discover meaning in life through logotherapy. So the first one is creating value by creating work or accomplishing a task. The second one is experiential value, so receiving something from the world through appreciation and gratitude, by fully experiencing something or loving someone. So kind of putting some of that goodness and that good energy out there and receiving something in return because of it. And then the final one is attitudinal value, so adopting a certain attitude towards inevitable suffering. So kind of understanding that as a human being, suffering at some point, pain at some point is inevitable, and kind of having an accepting attitude towards that rather than constantly wanting to push that away or resist kind of the inevitable. And I actually have two of his quotes kind of hanging up in my office, and one of my favorite ones is, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." Because we can sometimes get stuck with feeling victimized by certain things. And this obviously does not include people who are truly victims of things such as domestic violence. But when we put a label on ourselves, or even when we receive a mental health diagnosis or feel victim to our circumstances, this can sometimes breed complacency and comfortability. So for an example, if I have depression, I'm just a depressed person, what's the point? Rather than I'm a whole human being who may be experiencing depression, but that's not my entirety. My purpose in life is not to exist as just a human being with depression. So let us kind of lean into this and find meaning in this experience so that we may move forward from it.
I love that. And the sentence that you just stated about not placing labels and allowing that to form your identity, I think is so, so important outside of the mental health sphere, but identity in general. I feel like creating limitations for yourself starts with placing labels on who you are. And like you said, you are not a human being that is here to be classified as someone with depression. You are a whole human being experiencing depression. In today's society, I feel that it is so prominent for an individual, a community, a society to want to place labels on a person or a group of people and conform them into this preconceived identity of who they should be, or something of their current situation that makes them into the person that they are, and breaking that to create more of a limitless identity and encompassing the entire human experience outside of you're experiencing depression right now, or so now you are depressed, you have to act this way. How do you deal with a client who might be stuck in that mentality of, okay, they are a depressed person and that's the entirety of their identity? I know that you talked about leaning into it and accepting it, but what are some real-time practices that you help those clients or individuals to employ to break free from those boundaries on their identities?
Sure. So something that can be really beneficial is culture and religion, as we kind of talked about earlier. So, kind of exploring, if you are somebody that practices a certain faith, what does your faith say about, life's purpose, life's journey, and kind of getting them to view it from that lens, if that's something that brings them comfort, but also tapping into their strengths. What are some of their strengths? How can they use these strengths to create meaning in their life? There's an art therapy experiential that I love to do with clients called Trees of Strength, where it kind of helps them to kind of visualize themselves as a tree, and it gets them to kind of focus on the positive qualities that they have, but also their support systems. And so the roots kind of represent the things that ground them in the present moment, but also the things about them that are kind of hidden underneath the surface that they don't quite show to everybody. The trunk is their support system, and then kind of going up to the branches are their accomplishments, their strengths, their great qualities about themselves. So just getting them to shift their focus and attention more towards the things that they can actually utilize to pull themselves out of their condition, rather than just focusing on, like we said, I received this label as a depressed person. Now there's kind of this pressure, subconscious pressure, to fit into this box of what it means to be a depressed person. And sometimes people fall victim to that. So just shifting that focus out of this label that they received and seeing that a depressed person can still go on and have a very full, bright future ahead of themselves.
Very cool. Now that kind of bridges into the next topic that I want to cover, which is art therapy. And I know you gave that beautiful example, and we were talking offline a little bit about some of the workshops that you have posted on your profiles online. And I want to talk a little bit about what art therapy is, what some of the benefits are, and how drawing on the creative components to your clients or the people that you work with, or just in general in human beings, how that might help to foster a space for elevated mental health or cure some of those anxieties or negative emotions.
Sure. So I'll kind of give the American Art Therapy Association definition of art therapy, but then I'll give you an example to kind of see it in practice. Because probably the number one question I always get when I tell people I'm an art therapist is, that's really cool, but what is that?
Right.
And even when I kind of give them just the basic overview, it's still kind of hard to conceptualize. So by giving an example of what it looks like in practice, I think it helps people to understand its benefit. So art therapy is an integrative mental health and human services profession. So we utilize active art making, the creative process, and psychological theory within the psychotherapeutic relationship with our clients. So art therapy is used to improve cognitive, sensory motor functions. It helps to foster self-esteem, self-awareness, cultivate emotional resilience, promote insight, enhance social skills, reduce and resolve conflicts and distress, and it just helps to change one's overall condition. So an example that I can give was actually, I think it was my first year in graduate school for the art therapy program. And I was required to do some service learning hours. And the school that I went to has this annual art therapy program every year where families have been coming for decades to participate in. And I was in the children's group, and we had one participant in particular who I think was about a 5-year-old girl. She was very quiet, very tiny, seemed very frail. She was very shaky and didn't really participate much. But one day we were doing puppet making. And puppet making is a really helpful tool when it comes to children, especially if they experience anxiety, because they're able to tell stories from a third person perspective rather than a first person perspective. So they're able to get their story out and take control of their own narrative and feel empowered in a non threatening way. And this participant in particular kept insisting that her puppets were blue. She needed them to be blue with blue construction paper and blue faces. We didn't really understand it, but we said, okay, no problem. So she told a story of a daddy monkey being locked in a cage, and the baby monkey was crying out for help and crying for the daddy monkey from outside the cage. So when it was time for pickup, we were talking to her caregiver, which we later found out was her uncle. And without even telling him what she did that day, he was telling us that we wouldn't believe some of the things that she's been through. Her parents were utilizing drugs in utero, and they were drug addicts. And sometimes she would come home from school and find them and their friends pass out on their floor, and their skin would be blue. And dad was somebody who was in and out of jail. And so me and my group mates kind of made that connection that this blue skin represented in her subconscious what her parents look like when they're utilizing drugs. And the daddy monkey being locked in the cage was her father going away for periods of time being in jail. But because she's 5 years old and doesn't possess the same vocabulary as we do as adults, art therapy was kind of that medium where she was able to take things from her subconscious and kind of put it out there in her artwork and get that out of her mind. So that was kind of the first experience that I had where I kind of thought like, wow, this is something that actually works. This is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. That story alone, I think, encapsulates the value that art therapy has. And specifically, like you said, for children who don't possess the same vocabulary as we do, or the ability to assess their thoughts and their emotions and verbalize their experiences. That's really, really beneficial for kids in that scenario. But I feel like there are so many adults who also don't know how to communicate their feelings or their emotions with words to the level that you can, or someone who has dove deep into themselves and gone through that path of self-discovery. But I feel like art therapy is just as useful for adults who might have difficulty dealing with some of those negative emotions, and maybe they're positive emotions as well. But the ability to articulate those feelings is a developmental experience. Like, you have to dive deep into who you are and analyze your emotions to be able to articulate them. And I feel like art therapy creates that space for people who maybe have not had the time or the ability to do that, and it gives them that outlet. Where do you feel like that really comes into play and can be used to have major breakthroughs?
Yeah, so I think it is all of the above. I try to meet clients where they're at. So in art therapy, we have something that is called the ETC, the Expressive Therapies Continuum, which is 3 levels of functioning, or creative functioning. And the first one is kinesthetic sensory. So it's this very primary level where we're focused on kind of more so kinesthetic activities, kind of taking you back to your childhood, like finger painting, clay work. And on this level, you're really just focused on the sensory aspect of it, the kinesthetic aspect of it. And this is a level that's great for people who might be dealing with anxiety or stress. It's just helping to release that built up energy out of their bodies and kind of throwing it into artwork. You're still creating an end piece, but the aesthetic of the end piece is not the final goal. It's just more so the creative process at that time. And then at the very end of the spectrum, we have cognitive symbolic. So this is for people that have a higher level of creative functioning, that are able to conceptualize their emotions in a symbolic way. So they are going to be focused not only on the therapeutic process, of course, when it comes to the art making, but they are trying to create a self-satisfying end piece. So an example of like a cognitive symbolic art piece would be inside outside masks. And this is something that can be greatly utilized for people that have depression. So on the outside of the mask, the person is displaying or depicting how they think other people view them, but also what they show to other people. So we kind of talk about the concept of masks and how many of us wear masks, multiple masks throughout the day, depending on which types of environments that we're in. And people with depression, many of times, are putting on masks to mask that depression, to not show it to other people or let it creep through. And on the inside of the mask, they're able to depict what is it that they're actually keeping inside. Maybe it's stuff that they want to show to other people, but they don't have the skills or confidence to do so at the moment. So it really just depends on the person and where they're currently at with whatever condition they're struggling with. We're not necessarily going to see kids that many of the times on the cognitive symbolic end of the spectrum, depending on their age, but there's room for everybody, kind of like you said. Adults, especially adults that may experience things like generational trauma, they don't know how to communicate their feelings. They are used to conflict, they're used to arguments, they're used to fighting, abuse. So they don't know how to sit down and tell you how they're feeling in an assertive way using I statements. And so that's when art therapy can kind of help come into play and help them express themselves when they don't know how to use words.
Yeah, definitely. Do you yourself use art therapy to help work through some of your emotions ever?
I do. I definitely do when it comes to anxiety. I think art therapy is super beneficial for me. I love to take it to the very primal stage of the kinesthetic sensory, just because who doesn't love to feel sometimes like they're back in kindergarten art class? It's soothing. I love clay work. So yeah, I definitely apply it to myself when needed.
Very cool. I know there was one activity that I saw on your social media profile, and I believe it was I can't remember exactly what you drew, if whether it was a shape or not, but the controllables versus the uncontrollables. I felt like that was a really, really empowering activity because I know that a lot of anxiety for myself can stem from feeling like I need to control everything. And when something goes awry, if I can't fix it, I get very anxious about it. But the willingness to accept and embrace that you can control what is inside your circle and you have to release control to what is outside your ability to have your hands in and maintain or navigate or whatever that looks like. So can you just describe a little bit about what that activity in particular looks like and how someone might be able to do that if they wanted to try it out themselves after listening to this episode?
Yeah, definitely. And you definitely hit the nail on the head when it comes to anxiety. Anxiety loves the predictable, it loves reassurance. And so when we're not able to provide it with that reassurance and have control over the situation, that's kind of when it spirals. So this is a super simple activity that anybody can do, and all you need is a piece of paper and a pencil. So you're going to start off by tracing your hand onto the paper, and you're going to label inside of the hand things in my control. And on the outside of the hand, you're going to label it things out of my control. And you're going to take a couple minutes to brainstorm what are some things, it could be in general or things that pertain to a particular situation that's been anxiety inducing for you right now. What are some of the things that are in your control in the situation? So, things that you could actively work on to improve the current state of how you are. And then you're also going to take some time to focus on the things out of your control, the things that no matter how hard we fight against them, no matter how much we worry about them or get anxious about, we cannot change them. And the reason why we want to focus on those things is we want to be able to identify them so we can finally let them go. Because refocusing our energy onto the things that are in our control is really the most productive way to help us when we are faced with anxiety. When we are resisting things, that is when our anxiety ends up growing and puts us sometimes in a far worse state than when we began.
And that was actually my next question that I wanted to go into, was the idea of resisting and pushing away negative emotions, denying the experience of confronting them, and how that might actually foster more negative emotion, more anxiety. So really, I would like to talk about the idea of resistance to negative scenarios, negative emotions, everything like that. And just that dichotomy of, okay, we have resistance and we have acceptance. And how in your field do you feel that resistance can actually contribute to more pain? And how would you recommend a client work through something that they fear and have been resisting for so long, and bringing them to a point where they feel able to confront, whether it's an emotion or a person or a conflict, instead of resisting it, which then in turn brings more of those negative emotions?
Yeah, so I think in general, as human beings, we naturally want an immediate fix to any type of pain we experience. We want to self soothe, we want to make it go away. By resisting a feeling or life circumstance or experience, we're not allowing space for these emotions to go anywhere. So they end up being stuck with us and sometimes grow bigger and more difficult to cope with. And oftentimes, these are circumstances or experiences, kind of like what we said earlier, that are out of our control. So imagine how much physical and mental energy we are wasting on fighting against something we cannot change or that is out of our control. That no matter how much we cry, no matter how angry we get, we cannot change it and it will not change it. So by practicing something called radical acceptance, it can help us make space for these emotions to exit. And radical acceptance can be defined as our ability to accept situations that are outside of our control without judging them or wishing that they were different. And there is a woman named Marcia Linehan, and she is the creator of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And she likes to break down radical acceptance into three different parts. So the first one is accepting that the reality is what it is, accepting that the event or situation causing pain has a cause. And this can kind of go back to logotherapy, which is finding meaning in that pain or suffering, that it's happening for a reason, and kind of leaning into that. And the third one is accepting that life can be worth living, even with painful events. And that can also go back to our conversation with depression, is that my main purpose here is not to be a person with depression or a depressed person. So kind of leaning into that and kind of understanding, why am I experiencing depression now, and growing from that. And so non-attachment to our current experiences does not mean that we do not feel pain, but that we do not let our pain turn into suffering. So practicing radical acceptance is such an important way to combat any type of resistance we may be feeling.
Absolutely. And I like that you broke it down into three parts. And I really appreciate how much you prepared and all of the things that you're bringing to the table in today's conversation. I feel like this is going to be something that everyone who listens is going to be able to derive something from. And I love that you are able to break down some of these really complex and profound ideas and coping mechanisms into simplistic terms that anybody and everybody can really understand, and like I said, derive meaning and benefit from. So I thank you for preparing so much to come into this conversation. And I think too that, in talking about these three steps, I feel like a lot of people get caught up in, once they have acknowledged the things that they cannot control, they then keep that record playing in their heads. And so I like that you talked about the three parts, because once you acknowledge the things that are out of your control or the things that are causing you your anxiety, it's important to allow those the space to exit. So not keeping them in that, lazy river, just keep them flowing in your brain. Like you have to create the space, you have to acknowledge, but then you also have to release.
For anxiety in specific, I guess there are certain ways that we can go about this, and I do appreciate you kind of pointing out the like psychoeducation component that I'm kind of bringing in today, because for me, psychoeducation is so important when it comes to learning about mental health and reducing the stigma, because oftentimes we fear what we don't know. So we hear these certain buzzwords when it comes to therapy or these certain diagnoses, and that can cause a lot of anxiety. But when we are educated on what these words mean or what these diagnoses look like, I think it takes away a lot of the fear, and it just helps people to gain a lot more acceptance and understanding of these mental health concepts as a whole. But for anxiety in specific, I think it's important also to look into our thinking traps. So, our thinking traps are basically these ways of thinking that trap us in anxiety. So, for example, somebody can struggle with catastrophizing. So, that is somebody imagining the worst case scenario, that worst case scenario is bound to come true. So helping them identify what their thinking traps are, and then practicing cognitive restructuring. So cognitive restructuring is going to be having the ability to identify your thinking traps in the moment and restructuring that thought into something that is more rational and grounded in reality. So, helping a client, let's say a client is worried about giving a presentation and passing out. Um, and so sometimes we'll have a client recall all the other times where they gave a presentation and they did it successfully with no issue, and helping them to recognize that we never passed out before, so why would this time be any different? So it really just takes sometimes time and experience with people that have anxiety to kind of recognize that that worst case scenario is not going to come true. Those thinking traps that we keep getting caught up on that are just like in a loop in our brain are not going to come true, and then just providing with the confidence to expose themselves to those experiences that induce anxiety and to recognize that they're able to go through with them with success.
That's awesome. Yeah, the thinking traps. That's a very, very interesting concept, and I think that the next step to the acceptance, to the release, it really begins with the self discovery and really analyzing your thought patterns, like you said, and recognizing what traps you have created for yourself. And once you recognize those traps, it allows you to be more aware and break those down so that you can re-navigate your thought process to practices or trains of thought that are, more beneficial. The next thing that I want to touch on, I know that we've talked about a lot, but I really, really appreciate this conversation has been very profound. So you very briefly mentioned something about generational trauma. And so there is a lot of information, again, out there online. I hear it a lot now. I hear generational trauma. I hear healing generational trauma. Okay, this is the daughter or the son who's going to heal all of their ancestors' pain from the past. What does that mean? And from a clinical psychologist's lens, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so generational trauma is a type of trauma that's transferred between generations. And this can cause many different symptoms like low self esteem, hopelessness. Sometimes it causes people to turn to substance use. It does cause many mental health disorders depending on the severity of the generational trauma. My first exposure to what generational trauma was a couple years ago. I was at a conference, the annual art therapy conference, and the keynote speaker was talking about transgenerational trauma, and she was giving an example of how, and she was an African American woman, about how sometimes she'll be having conversations with African American friends, and they will be talking about how some of their children's classmates were doing. Like some of the white moms will say like, oh yeah, like my son, he's like a star athlete, he's on honor roll, he's doing amazing. What about your son? And then the African American mom will be like, that boy, like he just drives me crazy. And the keynote speaker was talking about how this is like a common theme for Black moms that goes back to the time of slavery, where they'll downplay kind of the great qualities of their son, of their child, because back then they didn't want them to seem appealing to slave masters or slave owners. So if I'm able to kind of downplay my child and not make them seem interesting or great or capable or successful, that kind of protects them and keeps them away from harm. And so over time, that's just kind of a cycle that continues where the Black mom is not providing her son with praise or acknowledging his abilities. And even though he doesn't understand why she's doing this and she's doing this subconsciously to protect him, he's probably internalizing this like, my mom doesn't respect me. She doesn't think I'm capable. She doesn't think I'm great. And that's something that'll be passed on to his children and then the next generation and the next generation. So there is definitely strong roots when it comes to generational trauma that I think people could definitely benefit from exploring when it comes to their own family's history. Um, Learning the stories of family members can really help with this. So, being able to understand them outside of their label as mom, dad, aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, but as a human being with lived experiences far before we came around. And it's important to check in with ourselves to make sure, like I said, we're not carrying on any of these harmful behaviors or ways of thinking to the next generation. But I think some of the harm when it comes to social media, even though it can be really beneficial to see and hear from other people and that they're experiencing similar things to us, is something that we like to call like pop psychology. So, like these buzzwords that go around when it comes to mental health on social media, like being triggered or trauma. Not everything is trauma, at least not by the clinical definition. So even if something may feel traumatic to us, it doesn't actually fit, the diagnostic criteria to be somebody diagnosed with trauma. So I think sometimes people see something and run with it, and over time it can actually lose its meaning or harm people that actually do fit the criteria to be diagnosed with that, because they're kind of looking around like, well, they're saying that they're experiencing something traumatic, but it doesn't look like my trauma. Like, is this right? So I think we have to be careful about certain things like that. And not everything can be blamed on your parents, as like social media likes to say. Like sometimes our own behaviors, our own ways of thinking is what kind of led us to be in situations. So not everything can be blamed on family or generational trauma. So it's important, I think, to get a professional perspective on that and just take things you see on social media with a grain of salt.
Definitely. And very, very interesting story that you brought up from the keynote speaker that you heard. The inherited negative thought patterns, like you said, are subconscious half of the time, not really understanding the implications that that kind of way of describing a child or a friend or a loved one. It's kind of that nature versus nurture. Also, that argument is that you are somewhat of a product of your environment. And so that does have a very, very large impact on the way that you then internalize a relationship with a loved one and carry it out with another loved one. And so I think it comes all back to the self-discovery and the self-awareness and analyzing your thought patterns and how you deal with emotions. And I think what is so awesome about all of the conversations that are now being had about mental health is that it brings it to the forefront for then individuals to begin asking themselves the questions and have someone else that's giving them the guidance about how to ask those questions. And, these kind of things weren't really talked about in years past. And so although there is a lot of stuff going on social media, and sometimes it can be easy, like you said, to take something and run with it, it does plant the seed that hopefully is then watered by professional opinions and, help from someone who has experience in these fields so that it can then be recognized, nurtured in a way that is sustainable and then come to fruition in your relationships and your life. With generational trauma, sometimes when I hear you're healing your ancestors' generational trauma or you are breaking those negative patterns, have you ever had someone that you have worked with that has felt that that's actually more pressure on an individual and then creates more anxiety in that sense? Part of me feels that way when I read some of these things. It's like breaking generational trauma and feeling like that falls on me as an individual. Or I've had conversations with friends where it's like, oh, I feel like I have to heal all of my, relationships right now so that then I can develop the most beneficial relationships for, my offspring and everything like that. But then trying to heal everyone is a lot of pressure. And I don't think that that's necessarily the goal. But have you ever had to work through that with anyone? Do you have any pieces of advice for someone who might be taking that as pressure in healing generational trauma?
So I haven't had that experience like on a personal level with any of my clients, but I can definitely see how that can become like a double-edged sword where it can empower somebody to make changes because they're viewing it from, let's say, the collectivist lens where this is going to be something not only beneficial for me, but everybody around me as well. But then, like you said, it can add that extra pressure where I'm constantly now focusing on my siblings, my nieces and nephews, my cousins, and how is this affecting them and how are our family dynamics affecting their mental health. And it's up to me to fix all of that or unravel that when, like we kind of talked about earlier, generational trauma goes back so many generations and there's so many complexities there that it would be so hard for just one person to kind of unravel. So for somebody that's struggling with that, I would really want them to kind of sit down and think about what is their like inner purpose for wanting to do this and really kind of just viewing it from kind of more of like a personal perspective. I'm doing this so I can have a better quality of life. And those around me, if I'm healed, that's going to rub off on them eventually. I'm going to be showing them through example, through modeling, what it looks like to have a healthy conversation, what it looks like to have a healthy person to lean on. So if you're just doing the inner work for yourself, that also can help create a domino effect without having to focus on everybody else at the same time.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. I like that domino effect analogy. The last thing that I want to talk about very briefly, because I know that we're running up on the hour. It's been a great conversation so far, but I want to talk about imposter syndrome. I know that you referenced that in the questionnaire that I had sent over to you. What is imposter syndrome, and how do you work with some of your clients through experiencing imposter syndrome themselves?
Sure. So, imposter syndrome is the internal psychological experience of feeling like a phony in some area of your life, despite any type of success that you have achieved in that area. So, you might have imposter syndrome if you are somebody who is consistently experiencing self doubt, even in areas that you typically excel at. And I'm somebody who struggled with imposter syndrome so much in grad school and starting off as a therapist. Even like maybe 6 months ago, I was having an experience where I was checking in with two of my clients because we were kind of like at like I think about 90-day mark of their experiences in therapy, and I was just checking in to see how they were feeling. Do they feel like they're making progress? What's going on there? And both of them had really positive feedback towards me. They were talking about how helpful I've been. One of the youths that I was seeing was saying like how much their parents have noticed a difference in them, and mom was expressing the same sentiment. And my first thought was, well, that has nothing to do with me. Like, that must be like some sort of fluke. Like, I didn't do any of that. Like, I'm not responsible for that. And I was talking to my supervisor about it, and she's like, why would you think that? Like, even if you don't feel like you're doing anything, just being there and modeling what it looks like to have a healthy conversation and to hold space for somebody can be more than enough. So it was like kind of like my automatic thought that if a client is giving me positive feedback, that it's not because of something I'm doing. There's no way, like I'm a good, like capable therapist. So that was really something like I had to work through. But for somebody that's struggling with imposter syndrome, I would definitely ask them to check in to see which core beliefs they're currently holding on to. And our core beliefs are just our personal beliefs about ourselves, the world, and others. And these beliefs, in a way, act like a lens in which we view situations or life experiences. So, for example, somebody who has a negative core belief could not get a job opportunity or job offer. So, the thought that they have is, I'm not capable. So, their behavior moving forward is, they're not going to apply to any other jobs because they don't feel like they're capable. But somebody with a positive core belief who did not get the job offer would think, I am capable. So the behavior moving forward is, I'm just going to apply to other jobs and see what I get into. So it's the same experience, but because these people have two different core beliefs, that in turn affects their way of thinking and then their behaviors following through. So check in with your core beliefs, see what you're internalizing about yourself and your abilities, and work on restructuring those core beliefs into something that's more positive. Because if I'm viewing life from a positive lens, I'm going to believe that I'm capable to accomplish whatever task is being thrown my way.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that takes practice, and it doesn't just happen immediately. If you're someone who has negative core beliefs, it takes a little bit of time to redevelop new thought patterns. But eventually you can rewire your brain to think in a certain way. And I think that the importance of your thoughts is so profound because, again, like you said, your thoughts become your actions. If you have a negative core belief that you are not capable, then you will not apply for a job, and then it closes you off to opportunities. But if you continue to filter positive thoughts into your brain, then you start to generate this idea that you are capable, and you open up more doors for yourself. So I think that nurturing that over time and knowing it's not going to just come immediately, and that it does require some amount of effort, but that there are resources out there, whether it is a therapist or whether it is a group of people or a support group or activities like art therapy that do nurture that space for you to develop more positive core beliefs, I think is very, very cool. So with that being said, I want to thank you again for such an amazing conversation, Sara. And I appreciate your authenticity and all of your knowledge that you brought to the table. I'm super excited to share this because I think that I know I myself learned so much today, and I'm excited for everyone who's going to be able to listen to this, to take some of the things that we talked about and put them into practice. And even if not put into practice immediately, plant the seed for awareness to start doing more research or potentially consult a professional if they are experiencing some of the issues that we touched on today. So I want to give you a moment to allow listeners the opportunity to connect with you after the show. If you have anything that you want to plug, any specific websites or books that maybe helped bring you to the point that you're at today, now is the time for you to go ahead and do that.
Sure. And thank you so much, Gabby, for inviting me onto your platform. I loved today's conversation. I feel like it was really thought-provoking for myself, especially. So I'm excited for listeners to hear this and hopefully learn something from it and take something away. And if you're somebody who's listening and kind of been on the fence when it comes to therapy, I hope this is maybe your push to try it out and see if that's something that's going to be of benefit for you. So thank you so much for that. For those of you that want to keep up with me afterwards, you can look me up on Psychology Today if you want to engage in therapy with me. I have some availability for that right now. I also have an Instagram account where I post a lot of psychoeducation when it comes to different things in therapy and psychology, and I also have videos of art therapy experientials that you could try at home, and that is Ancora Imparo Therapy, and that is ANCORAIMPARO Therapy. Some books are At Last a Life by Paul David, which I think is the holy grail of books when it comes to anxiety. It's just very straight to the point. It helped me so much in my own personal journey, so I really encourage people to look those books up. He has a 2-part series for that. Nothing else off the top of my head, but if you follow my therapy page, I'm sure I'll post some again in the future. I do post what I'm currently reading on my stories many of the times.
Awesome. And I will go ahead and link your Instagram in the episode description. And I will also include a link to that book that you referenced as well. So everyone make sure to check out that description if you are interested in following Sara's journey. And again, thank you so much, Sara. I really, really appreciate your time today. And I'm super excited to share this episode with everyone. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Crucial Conversations. I hope that you were inspired by this talk and reminded that you are capable of anything you have the capacity to imagine. Share this episode with someone that you want to help unlock their maximum potential. Because sometimes in order to find the answers, you have to know how to ask the questions. And that is what we do on this podcast. I love you all, and I will see you next time on Crucial Conversations.